As we approach Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20, we are approaching a Mount Everest of sorts when it just comes to describing Christ, who he is, and what he's done, and what effect that has on all of us. And so as we begin to dive into these verses, I want you to see that Paul has chosen very specifically to write these verses kind of like a poem, or almost like something that you could sing or memorize. It's something that as you read it, it should cause you to like shout out to experience the joy of poetry as we dig into the layers. But sometimes also when we read it, like many passages, it's very dense. And so when we first look at it, it's easy to just skim over it and not really know what it means. To know, I think that's important, but I don't really know what's important about it or how it applies to me. And so what I want to do in this video is teach you a few skills for how we can understand biblical poetry like what we're seeing here. And the main two skills I want to work on in this video is understanding the basic structure and then looking for repetition within the poem. All right, so let's begin. Let's read Colossians 1, verses 15 through 18 together. And what we're going to do is look for structure and repeated phrases. All right, let's read it. So it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent." All right, so as we read that passage, I'm sure that you heard some words repeated over and over. So what we're going to do first of all is just kind of circle or highlight some of those words that we heard a lot. So for me, I heard this phrase, "he is," right? He is the image of the invisible God. And then it gives a description a little bit more about him. And then it says, "And he is before all things." And then he is the head of the body, and also he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. And so one of the things that's really helpful when we're trying to get the basic structure of the passage is actually to only focus on the main ideas and to kind of subtract all the supporting details. So for example, if we were to just take our pen and we were to cross out all of these things that are not the main part of the passage, we could easily see what are like the main things that Paul is trying to get across about who Jesus is. To make this more obvious, I wanted to make this slide for you. And this is kind of Paul's poem broken down into four main sections. So it says, "He is," and then it describes him. He is the image of the invisible God, right? The firstborn of all creation. He is before all things and holding all things together. He is the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. And so Paul wants to make these four big claims, and he says at the very end of the passage, he gives us a big "so that." All right, and so what's the reasoning? What is the connecting tissue between all of these? Well, here it is right here. Paul says, "So that all these things, he is all of these things, so that he might come to have first place in everything." The word he uses in the ESV is preeminent, but when you think about first place, right? What do you think about? Maybe it's like when you're running a race, right? And you win first place. First of all, you get the prize. Whatever you're competing for, you get the prize. You get the reward for winning. But also you get praise, right? People congratulate you and say, "Wow, that's amazing that you did this." And I think very similarly here, when Paul is saying that he might have first place, it's talking about a prize or reward, or even inheritance. And then it's also talking about praise, and a word that the Bible often uses to describe praise is glory. Praise and glory. And so here in this passage, we can already see at the outset that God is going to be described as these four things, and these are going to be for the sake of his prize and for the sake of his praise. So now let's go through these four things and let's break down the passage bit by bit. And again, I want to encourage you that if you have a notebook or a journal, write this out with me and you can go through it as we go through it. Okay, so as we look at Colossians 1, 15 through 16, it says that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And then we're going to see a lot of repetition here. It says, "For by him all things were created. And then it gives us some examples of all these things, right? Things on heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. It says again, all things were created through him and for him. So what I want you to notice is these descriptions of these things are really cool, and we're going to get into a little bit of the details for those things. But even if you didn't fully understand all the descriptions that Paul's wanting you to see, you can just see in this last phrase, all things were created through him and for him. He is the creator of all things. So what you can see is this first section is Paul's wanting us to see that Jesus is creator. All right, he is creator. And here is going to describe a little bit more about him up top. So it says he is the image of the invisible God. So here we can see that God is described as invisible. In other passages in the Bible, it talks about how no one has seen God, or we even can't see God because he's so holy that if we were to look upon him, we would just melt, basically. So God is described as invisible, but Jesus is described as the image of the invisible God. In other words, if you want to know what God looks like, you want to know how God acts or what he's like, you can look at Jesus and you can know exactly what God is like. I want to show you this in a few other passages. Later in Colossians, in chapter 2, it says, for in Jesus, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. So it's like everything that God is dwells bodily in the person of Jesus. That's pretty cool. Love that. Also in Hebrews 1, it says that long ago and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, and through whom he also, here's our word, created the world. And then here's how it describes Jesus in Hebrews. It says that he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the words of his power. I like this word, that he's the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature. When we think about image, we often think about like reflecting something, like mirroring something. But when I think about imprint, I almost think about like a thumbprint or something like that. And it's all in the DNA, and you can know exactly what he's like. And when we look at Jesus, it's like we're looking at exactly what God is like. It's his imprint, it's his radiance, it's his glory. Jesus puts all of that on display so that we can know him. And then it also says that he is the firstborn. Okay? The firstborn of all creation. Now, here's where we can get confused. Because oftentimes when we're studying the Bible and we see a word like firstborn, if we don't understand what it means, it can be helpful to like break it apart. And so if you were to break apart this word, you would think, okay, first and born. So Jesus is the first one born. But what we know from other passages in Scripture is that Jesus wasn't born like that. He wasn't created in the way that you and I are created. And we see that even in the very next phrase. It says that he was the firstborn of all creation, and by him all things were created. So if Jesus would have been created or would have been born like you and I were, it would make him like creation and not the creator of all creation. And we can see this. Let me give you some examples. Sometimes when you break apart words, it can actually make them unhelpful. So for example, the word butterfly. We know what a butterfly is, but if we were to try to describe it and we used butter and fly, we're getting further away from the meaning, not closer to the meaning. Another example would be driveway. If you break this word apart, you might think that a driveway is like the way that you drive, like almost like a highway. But we know that a driveway is actually where you park. So breaking these words apart doesn't get us closer to the meaning, it gets it further away. So the question is, what does Paul mean here by firstborn? And as we look at it, in the Jewish society or in like biblical culture in that time, the firstborn was often given like the inheritance. So for example, when the father would pass away or when it came time for the son to move on, he was given like a lot of the family money and structure and stuff so that he could continue to carry on the family name. The firstborn spoke to a position, and it also spoke to priority. Okay, position and priority. He was kind of elevated. He was the firstborn son. Everything that the father had belonged to him. And I think that that is the type of meaning that Paul has here when he says he's the firstborn of all creation. It means that has a priority. He has position, that he is first among all. So what's cool is then Paul begins to say that all things were created, and he gives us a lot of ways of thinking about that, or a lot of categories to think about all things. So he says in heaven and on earth. So here he's giving us like spatial language, right? So the things here where you are and the things where you're not, like the things on earth and the things in heaven or on the skies. He says visible and invisible. So this is like physical things and non-physical things, things that you can see and things that you can't see. And then he says whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, the best word I could use to describe this is like power structures, right? So whether it's the White House or the ruler of Rome or the emperor or the local mayor or anything, that every form of authority and all of that's been created, all of that was created through him and for him. So let's look at the next verse. It says, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This has been one of the most encouraging verses to me in my life because often I can feel like I'm the one that's trying to hold all things together, that's trying to make all these things work out and not fall apart. And often I have to remind myself that, no, Austin, you're not the one holding all things together. He is. He's not like the watchmaker that just created the watch and winds it up and sends it out to see how long it lasts. He is involved in intimate details of your life. He is there, he's present, and he is holding all things together. In other words, he is a sustainer. He is a sustainer, and he's present in every situation in life. And then Paul gives us this next big statement, and it says that he is the head of the body, the church. Now, this is one of those phrases that throughout history has been interpreted in a lot of different ways, and I think it's really important that we do our best to understand what did Paul really mean when he said that Christ is the head of the body. And what I want to submit to you is that I think that the image that Paul is trying to give us is a little bit like this head, but also the picture of like a source of water. You know, before water will split into like many streams, it's like the head of the river is the source where everything flows from. And why do I say that? Well, when we look into Colossians 2, I want you to read this phrase with me. Paul says, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up about reasons by a sensuous mind, and not holding fast to, here's our phrase, the head, from whom the whole body, again, this is like from whom, this is language of a source. The whole body is nourished and knit together, right? Nourished and knit together. So when it says head here for Paul, it means that not only is it the source, but it's the source of nourishment, okay, and the source of unity. All of that comes from being connected to the head. So now let's go back to our passage. It says he is the head of the body. So again, his church is described as a family in some passages, and here it's described as his body. When I think about it, I think about this. If you ever see a little kid when they're young, their bodies are really small, but their head is already like big and developed, and they kind of like wobble a little bit because they have these big heads and little bodies. And I think that's the picture here as Paul's writing to the church. He's like, man, your head, Jesus, is the head of the body. He's the source of everything you need, and he is big and beautiful, right? But you're still so much in a development process that your body is still very small. And so your Christian life is about growing up into the head, being nourished and being knit together and becoming united into the head, which is Jesus. And then finally, Paul summarizes everything he's been saying by saying, once again, he is the beginning. What's interesting is Paul has already said that he was like the head of all creation, but here he has in mind new creation. And we can see that because it says that Jesus is the firstborn, that language again of firstborn, from the dead. So Jesus is inaugurating a new beginning, right? A new creation as the first one, the resurrected one. And just like we talked about earlier, the firstborn, all the inheritance, everything that the father had was given to him. And here it makes this make a lot more sense when it says, so that in him, so that he might come to have first place, right, in everything, so that he would have his prize, namely, that he would have you and me as sons and daughters, parts of his body. He would have his prize and he would have his praise. As more and more people put their faith in Christ, that come into the family of God, are united into the family of God, Jesus receives more and more glory. He receives the inheritance that's due him. And as you read a passage like this, it's not only just like good for our minds to learn more about God, but what it does for Paul is it causes them to break out into poetry, to break out into song and be like, wow, like God is so amazing. Jesus is incredible and there is no one else like him. So I pray today that as you watch this video and maybe you spend a little bit of time in this passage, that you would just look around and go like, wow, there is no one like Jesus. There is no one as beautiful or compelling as him.